put your hands together for Carol Hoenig.
Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Good. I get the honor of not only introducing but interviewing Emma, and the excitement has been crazy, Emma. So Emma Donoghue is the author of 16 novels, including the award-winning national bestseller Room, the basis for the acclaimed film of the same name. She's also written the screenplays for Room and The Wonder, and 9 stage plays. Her next film, adapted from Philippa Lowthorpe's from Helen McDonald's memoir, is H is for Hawk. Beautiful book, beautiful book. Her latest novel is The Paris Express. There's so many reviews, but I just wanted to read this one from the Washington Post by Lee Haber. A riveting mix of social commentary and mystery. Has much in common with Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express. Meticulous research has gone into the writing of this thriller, including into the real-life passengers on the original train. So if the steam engine is an astonishing feat of engineering, so is Donoghue's propulsive and thought-provoking 16th novel. She was born in Dublin, she lives in Ontario, but she's here with us today in Long Beach, so please welcome Emma.
Thank you, Carol, and I only wish that I had a perfect Parisian shirt to tour with, like Carol does. You know, I've had about a year and a half to prepare for this tour. Why did I not find myself such a shirt? And I was in Boston yesterday on Paddy's Day without anything in green either. So I need a stylist for my tours.
Well, I actually, it was funny because I did go to my closet this morning. So what am I going to wear? And I was like, oh, it's a no-brainer.
Do you have a shirt for every book?
No, but I should, I think, definitely. So, you know, as I was reading this, I had the honor also of getting an advanced reader copy, and all I kept thinking is the research that you must have done. But I also want to hear what inspired you initially to want to write about this.
Well, there's a photograph in the back of this book in the author's note, and that photograph is what inspired this novel all at once. I knew I was going to be spending a year in Paris because my partner is a professor of French, so whenever she gets a year on sabbatical or for an exchange, we go and immerse the kids in French. So I knew we'd be staying in the area of Montparnasse in Paris because that was the only place we could find a 3-bedroom apartment. So I thought, oh, Montparnasse, you know, anything interesting ever happened there? So I Googled it, and the first thing I saw was this extraordinary photograph of a train coming out a window, bursting a building apart, and landing vertically on its nose. So I thought, okay, I need to know what happened there. And as soon as I read about this crash, I thought, this is my next novel. Because you might say there have been many disasters. What's interesting about this one? But this one was entirely about speed. They wanted to get to Paris on time like they did every day, but what was different that particular day, the 22nd of October 1895, is that one rich, privileged customer said, could you make an extra stop, pick me up in the village near my country house, and give 10 minutes to attaching my private train carriage. So because of this, they were 10 minutes late, which in my home country of Ireland would have been no bother at all. But in France in 1895, this was a time of modernity and progress and efficiency, and so the driver and stoker clearly felt they had to make up the time by dashing into Paris at speed. So the book is all about speed.
That was amazing, and as you have so many characters, and some of them were in real life, and some you made fictional, which I loved. And it wasn't a challenge for me to remember who was who, so you did a great job with the descriptions. It was, you know, but you also made the train a character, which I found so interesting. Was that something you intended to do from the get-go?
Well, you'll know yourself, Carol, as a novelist. Often what we see in books is the kind of fossilized print of an original thing we tried that didn't work. So I've always wanted to write with a sort of, you know, omniscient narrator like in 19th century novels who would know everything. And every time I've tried this, at a certain point I go, I don't believe this. I think everybody sees the world differently, so I clearly can't maintain that Victorian voice of authority thing. But I was left with these passages that talked a lot about trains and had this kind of, bird's eye perspective on the action, as it were. And I thought, well, okay, maybe I'll make the train herself, because they always said she about trains. Maybe I'll make the train one of my point of view characters, because she has a stake in this. And also the driver, there's a whole crew, the 4-man crew of the train would have worked on this particular train every single day, because the railway companies loved to make a kind of a 3-way partnership of the driver, the stoker, they stood side by side on the little unsheltered platform, and their train. It was those 3 every day, because the better the 3 of those knew each other, the more efficiently they could work. So yeah, my engine 721 had to become one of the characters.
And the fact that you described it, and it was interesting how you did the research, but not only that, how to put a bomb together.
So Google now thinks that I want to know how to put bombs together. Sometimes I wish I could put in my Google search and then do a special little, in brackets, only for research, honestly. Then they try and sell me the ingredients. Yes, I tried to describe it in such a way that nobody could, use it as an instruction manual.
That's a good idea.
The reason for the bomber on my train is that when this terrible crash happened, the journalists asked the locals, what did you think when you heard that loud sound? And several of them independently said, oh, we assumed it was a bomb, an anarchist bomb, because by the 1890s, radical left-wing terrorism had spread across the world. The president of France had been stabbed to death by an anarchist the previous year. There had been bombs in Parliament, in restaurants. In Britain, the Irish, the IRA, had done bombs on trains. I mean, urban people were just used to that as the price of, busy urban life. Every now and then somebody will try and blow us up, but we're still going to get to the book reading in the Long Beach Library. Nothing will stop us. So I decided, what if there had been a bomb on the train, just to complicate my story? And I thought immediately, who should my bomber be? Because, in 19th century novels, when there's a bomber, he's usually a very gaunt Eastern European male in his maybe 50s in a big coat, And I thought, well, actually, I want one of the very young idealistic radicals, and I'm going to choose a young woman who was in radical circles and was eaten up by justifiable rage about how the poor were treated, how women were treated, all those who were being left behind by this, busy economy and progress. So yes, Madeleine Pelletier on my train is only 21 and is carrying a lunch bucket, and which is a homemade bomb. And that's not really giving anything away, because she's there on page 1.
And you have the reader watching that lunch bucket the whole time, where is it?
They're very tippy.
Yeah, exactly.
And 19th century trains shook a lot. I mean, it was not a comfy, smooth experience. They also, people will be expecting a train like in sort of 1930s novels on, where there are corridors, right, and you're chased by the Nazis, or you hide in the toilet, or you meet a stranger in the dining car. But 1895, these trains had none of those extra conveniences. No corridors, no toilets, no dining car. So you just got into your carriage and you shut the door. You stayed in that carriage, effectively confined there with these strangers until the next stop, which might be an hour and a half away. So it gave a real rhythm to my book, that you'd have these long stretches when they were between stops on this express route, and then there'd be 5 minutes where everyone gets to jump off and try and grab a sandwich, run around the back and look for a toilet, change carriages if you can't stand who you're traveling with. So the person I related to most was actually the senior guard, Mr. Mariette, whose job it is to get everyone back on the train after the 5 minutes so as not to waste time. So I really related to his kind of tension about how can I possibly round up all these cats, I only have 2 kids, but it's often felt like that, no, you don't need to go to the toilet again, come on.
Well, you have so many characters, and you kind of touched on it, but you have favorites of these characters?
You can't not, really.
Yeah.
I really liked, there's a Russian charity worker traveling on the train. She's a real person. by the way, I know some of the real people who were on the train that day because the newspapers interviewed them. So we know, say, there was an arms manufacturer who gave an interview, and he said that he had told his wife and her friend to sit up on the seats, pull their legs up, because otherwise their legs might get severed if the carriage is telescoped. So we know a few of the real people, but mostly we don't know who was on that train. And so I've just invited on any real people who were in northern France in 1895 and could plausibly have been on the train. I mean, basically, 1890s Paris was such a throbbingly exciting hub city, a destination for anyone who had a bit of spark to them, from Cambodian students to American painters to North African coffee sellers. I didn't need to make anybody up, really. These are all real people at the time who I just thought it was plausible that they would end up on that train. So yeah, Blonska was an Eastern European, probably Russian émigré, who worked as a librarian for some literary men, but in her spare time she just helped the poor a lot. And rich ladies would give her money that she would go pass on to anyone who was in need. And I just love her kind of practical, her unwillingness to spend any money on herself. She just got a kick out of trying to make the world better. Because one question this novel asks is, what do you do about the unfairness of the world? What do you do when you perceive the government to be tyrannical? What are some good and bad ways of fighting back? So young Madeleine Pelletier is like, I'm going to blow it all up. And Blonska, much older and wiser, is like, I want to leave the world a tiny bit cleaner than I found it. So that's one of the great kind of dilemmas that the novel explores.
Well, not to give anything away, when you were writing this, I was surprised how it ended. It wasn't where I thought we were going. Did you know how it was going to end?
I did, yeah. I'm a big planner because I would say I'm not naturally gifted about plot at all. As you can tell, I'm Gabby, right? I grew up in a house of 10 people. I was the youngest of 8, always waiting for my chance to contribute something to the conversation. So dialogue can spew out of me till the cows come home, It's just no bother to me at all. But shaping a plot did not come naturally to me at all, Carol, and I felt I really needed to learn that as a novelist. And one thing that really helps me is to plan in detail what's going to happen in each chapter and then each scene. Because when I lay it all out like that, I can see the things that happen there, and there seem remarkably similar. So why don't we make that one scene? And nothing at all seems to happen in chapter 3, so maybe cut chapter 3. So planning is actually a great help if you feel there's a literary skill that you don't have as strongly as you'd like to have. Yeah.
Do you do that with all your books?
I do. Now, the great thing is, like an architect can't suddenly change her plans halfway because things fall down. But with a book, you can absolutely deviate from the plan as you go along. My first historical novel, Slammerkin, I wrote it, and then I noticed that 2 of the characters seemed to be flirting with each other. Completely unplanned, but they were 2 different servants in an 18th century household, and there was a vibe. So I was like, okay, and I did another draft in which the 2 of them have a short tragic love affair. So I love that about fiction. It's very flexible that way. And there were characters who I planned to have on my train, and I included, I wrote several scenes from their point of view, and then I was like, I'm sorry, you're just not quite earning your seat, And they were sometimes quite famous people with very interesting backstories, but that particular day on that particular train journey, there was not enough going on. So I would, I'd say to my family, I pushed that person off the train today. I had to be ruthless, and above all, it couldn't get too slow or too long-winded, because if you write a novel about an express train, it has to move like a train. It has to stay on track, and it has to move with speed and with momentum towards where it's going.
Well, since you said that, this does take place in a relatively short time.
Yeah, it's like 8 hours.
So did you struggle with how to pace it?
Yeah, I had to think a lot about when to bring characters on, for instance, because you can't introduce everyone on page 1. So sometimes I'd be like, ooh, she doesn't actually have to join until the next town along, and what if that person changes to that carriage? So it was quite fiddly, yeah. And I knew that the guards would have to check people's tickets, but they would have to do it by getting into a carriage and then staying in that carriage until they were at the next far off station. So there was a lot of okay, if he glances in the window there, and then he sits in that carriage then, Yeah, it was quite fiddly, and I felt I was constantly trying to sort of, do crowd control on these people. But, identifying with the guard is better than, in some of my novels, I felt like the captor. Like with Room, because I was writing about a man keeping a woman locked up in a room for 7 years, I felt I was him, because I was the one choosing her furniture on IKEA, like almost the cheapest level. From the IKEA website, I'd be like, yeah, I think that's the bed he'd buy, So it made me realize that the writer is always, in some sense, the captor or tormentor of her characters, because we like to give them problems, don't we, Carol? We throw obstacles at them, because obstacle makes story.
Absolutely. Well, moving on a little bit, you also write screenplays, and that to me is amazing, because I did try to write a screenplay, and I just don't have the capability for whatever reason. And I'm astounded when authors can also write screenplays. So the format seems quite different. Did you have a challenge with that at all?
Well, I got, a huge stack of books, and I really tried to obey all the rules. And then, interestingly, when I was then working with my director, Lenny Abramson, on the film of Room, he kept saying to me, like, oh, forget about the rules. Like he never ever said the climax needs to be on page 60 or any of those so-called rules. So I realized a lot of those rules are how you can write a screenplay that sort of looks very professional, that might attract the eye of a company. But if you're already working with a company on something, you don't necessarily have to stick to all the rules. For instance, there's a so-called rule that you should come into the scene late and get out early. Just show the absolutely crucial bits of dialogue. Whereas, on Room, he said, look, can you write it for me more like a wildlife documentary? Just give me long stretches of the mother and child interacting in that room, and then I'll find the places to cut in the editing process. So he made me feel a bit more relaxed about those rules, The main thing is just that you have to say to yourself, how can I tell the story visually, rather than relying on either giving their thoughts or their dialogue as I would in a novel.
We're going to open it up to questions in just a minute, but I wrote this down when I was reading your book, and I don't even know if you have anything to say about it. It's just something that you said, and I was like, oh, I like that. And you said, animals act without thinking, whereas people wait for explanations. I don't know if you have anything to weigh in on that or not, but I just loved that. I was like, that's so true. But then again, I guess some people do act without thinking.
Well, certainly when you're writing any novel, which is a sort of ensemble piece, like a lot of different people, it makes you realize everybody arrives with their little sort of storyline in their head, and how they react to circumstances en route, or even to the same object, will totally depend on their storyline. So there's a moment when they flash past the Eiffel Tower on the outskirts of Paris, and to the 7-year-old in that third-class carriage, this is just like the wildest, strangest structure, highest structure he's ever seen in his life. To somebody else in the carriage who's a priest, this is like a sign of godless modern society, all that ugly hulking metal rearing up higher than cathedrals, how dare they? To others it's a beautiful thing. So everyone sees the Eiffel Tower differently, and I really tried to capture that mindset, and above all, make the range of characters in the novel as varied as possible, because it's funny, people often think of like diversity as this duty, this onus that's put on novelists today, like, oh, you're meant to be diverse, but actually it just makes the book more interesting if our characters are a wide range. So the multicultural nature of Paris society in the 1890s was a gift to me, because I didn't want everybody to be like the cast of Downton Abbey. I wanted a range.
I love that. Now, I don't know if you realize they're filming this interview, and so your questions, if you have questions, speak loudly so the people that are watching it can hear it. So, does anyone have a question?
With the many characters in your book, I haven't read the book yet. Do they remind you of people that you've actually known in real life?
Great questions. Great questions. Do any of the characters remind me of people I know in real life? Funny story. Usually I know when I borrowed things from a friend, or based it on my mother or something. But I say that because in my first historical novel, Slammerton, I based the murder victim on my mother. I didn't think my mother would notice because none of the externals were the same, But my mother read it in draft and she said, I'm the one who gets it with a cleaver, haven't I? Yes, thank you. Thank you for your service. You know. But in this one, it happened to me without realizing it, because I was writing this Russian Blonska, the very austere and tough charity worker. You know, because she's a real historical person, I just thought I was trying to imagine things that would fit with the facts of Blonska's life. But then I handed the novel to a Polish friend of mine, and as I handed it to her, I said, I just now realised that really you're the character basis for Blonska, because, you know, my friend sort of delights in, you know, going on a demonstration and risking getting arrested, or, you know, living on as little money as possible. She just embraces that sort of, you know, life under the Iron Curtain in Poland before the fall of the USSR. She has that kind of tough, gleeful attitude. And I realised that I owed it all to her. And then she read the novel and she was like, yep, I can see that. For instance, Blonska in my novel spends the night before the train journey on the cold platform waiting, because she doesn't want to waste a night in a hotel in terms of the money, when she could give that money to someone who really needs it. And my friend said, yeah, I did that in Barcelona. So yes, thank you so much to all my friends and family. My poor kids, you know, every book I write, they're like, is this us again in some weird new form? You know, us in a locked room, us on a medieval island. Yes?
I'm wondering, there are so many books that start with the Paris Librarian, the Paris Diary. Did you perhaps think about not starting with the Paris?
I find publishers have a large role in choosing your title, and my publishers were very eager for the book to mention the fact that it ends in Paris. Yeah. I think what publishers find really sad is the prospect that people who would love this book don't find it, and so they often are quite eager for you to use maybe some familiar hooks to point out to people, you know, this novel has something to do with Paris, because Paris, it does have a unique charm and hold on everyone who's ever been there. And I was quite happy to pay homage to the city, given that I spent a whole year there while I was writing it. Yeah, very fond of the place.
Hi, Long Beach, a library, it picked The Wonder, which is one of your many books, and we're meeting this month to discuss the book, and I know that it is, you did research on the fasting girls. It was just a remarkable story. It really took me to Ireland, very descriptive, time and place. And you had the nun and you had the nurse, Lil, right? That was her name. Are they based on anyone or just your imagination? And it was a terrific book. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And yeah, The Wonder it's a little unusual for me in that there were lots of interesting cases of so-called fasting girls or women who would claim, or others would claim about them, that they were living without food. But the one I'd heard about first was a real case in Wales, and I just couldn't bring myself to write about that case because it was so sad. Because basically this little girl was surviving fine, Sarah Jacobs, and then the Times newspaper funded a careful surveillance of her. It sent in nurses to watch her, and she died in a week. So I was just like haunted by that case, but couldn't write about it. And then, I swear, about 15 years after I heard the case, it suddenly occurred to me, I could write a fictional version, couldn't I? Which would not be as heartbreaking. So I decided to set it in Ireland, because if you're going to be very critical of a culture and a church, it should be the one you come from, you know.
Good point, good point.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, Kathleen. So I'm so struck by the picture because I'm recently retired from a 20-year career at our local railroad. You all know the Long Island Railroad.
Thank you for your service.
You're welcome. Was a conductor before I became a manager, and since the train is a character, so I'm wondering, having come from that environment, I wanted to say is this poster is in several of the offices at our railroads.
Really?
Because it's such a striking.
Like a kind of in-joke for railway workers. I love it.
Yeah, so question is, did you speak with railroad employees, or because you seem to really know, like when you spoke about the train in the 1890s, how you stepped into the carriage and that was it. That's the train they show on Downton Abbey when they start, right? There's no corridor you get in. So I was just wondering how, since the train is the character, if you had also spoken to railroad people.
I didn't speak to modern railroad people, because in a way, like if you want to know how things were in the 1890s, you don't want to be too misled by how they are now. But I went on a steam train in Yorkshire that they have running, and I watched YouTube videos in which elderly Englishmen, spend 3 years of their life refurbishing a carriage and then do a demonstration video. Those were particularly helpful because nobody was pressing buttons in those days. Things were operated by pulling down or rotating little metal wheels. I also, looked at really, detailed Wikipedia entries on every little cog on that train, and used a lot of specifically train books. And one of the most useful ones I found was an English one by a station master in the 1870s. And he sort of listed all of the stressful parts of his job, parcels that leak or explode, or parcels that go missing, or, whiskey barrels that get, emptied by thieves. So he basically shared all his worries. I was just like, this is gold. This is a gold mine for me, So yeah, it's an absolutely fascinating world to write about, I think. And trains have been connected with literature from the beginning because people have needed books to read on the train. So say there would have been a hachette stall at each train station in France in those days. And there was a lovely slogan of "Banish monotony and ennui." I love it. But equally, books have used trains from the beginning because they're such a good metaphor for, a lot of people brought together and subjected to the same sort of arbitrary fate of what's going to happen that day. And even the way they move, towards a destination with speed, it's such a great image for how a narrative moves. So even though I'd been open to writing about any kind of disaster, but I'm glad this is the one I found because trains have a poetry to them that I think airplanes are hard to match. And unlike cars, they're not just one individual family, they're a cross-section of society.
I know destination is part of the plan today, because we have to get you out of here soon. So
On the Long Island Railroad, of course.
Yes. So I'll take one more question, and then you'll be signing books, and we have books for sale over here, and Emma will be signing over there. So one more question.
Oh, how do we choose
I know,
one?
we got so many hands up.
Okay, who thinks that they've been holding up their hand for a long time? Wave your hand curiously.
Competition.
Oh,
Do you want, okay, you.
She's like, yes. I always ask this of authors. What authors do you like to read?
well, I just devoured a book called The Wilds by Louis Bayard. I'm headlining in Virginia with him at a festival, and that book is about Oscar Wilde's wife and children, and it's just fantastically written. I didn't think he could squeeze anything new out of that story. I'm always so impressed when an author like, Hilary Mantel or Maggie Farrell manages to take a familiar old story and make it breathtakingly new. I'm so sorry I didn't get to answer all the questions.
Well, this was a real treat, and thank you so much,
Thank
Emma.
you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Carol.